Sex in the Shadows of the Church, Confessions of a Dark Past. Part 1. Beneath the Skin of a Holy Era. In one of the monasteries of eastern Francia, a young novice died after being tortured. Bees were found in his anus. A girl executed in the same region confessed under torture that she had used hornets to arouse herself. Around the same time, in southern Italy, monks treated fornication with vomiting from semen eaten on an empty stomach. These are not legends. These are documented practices. Holy times are just a shell. Underneath is pus, fear, and perversions that would get websites shut down today. But back then it was called chastity. This is not a historical anecdote. This is what we prefer to forget. The end of the 12th century. Europe is in the grip of Catholic fear. The Church turns the body into a weapon against itself. But the more fiercely it is forbidden, the deeper the perversion flourishes. Under the monastery roofs, there are moans. In peasant huts, there are rituals. And in castles, rape is committed under the guise of divine punishment. Medieval Europe knows neither consent, hygiene, nor anatomy. But it knows pain, humiliation, and blind faith that suffering brings one closer to God. Monastic treatises from the 12th to 13th centuries contain descriptions of the so-called cura spermae, sperm therapy. According to pseudo-medical records, sperm was considered a divine fluid secreted by men by the will of the Creator. One of the texts attributed to the monk Benedict of Cluny states, "If a virgin swallows a monk's semen after morning mass, her passion will be purified." The concept of sin of lust was interpreted as a disease, especially in women. They supposedly suffered from womb fever, an imaginary condition caused by an excess of moisture in the female body. Sometimes, in order to dry out a woman, she was subjected to forced cleansing. In monastery infirmaries, torture chambers, girls suspected of hysteria or internal fornication were tied to a bench and given herbal infusions, including those based on horseradish, mercury, and goat blood. But this was only the beginning. If the symptoms persisted, so-called vibration therapy was practiced, the exorcism of the devil by a monk or priest, most often accompanied by sadistic practices. Reports of this reached the inquisitors, but they considered it treatment rather than a crime. At the beginning of the 13th century, a series of rituals was documented in villages in Upper Bavaria, where girls placed bees in their wombs to stimulate holy blood. Historian Hans Köpke cites evidence that insects were placed in the vaginal cavity to enhance the feeling of ecstasy, which was interpreted as contact with God. The bites caused burning, swelling, and, by modern standards, fatal septicemia. But in that system of coordinates, it was an act of spiritual purification. In some cases, such as in the village of Neuhausen, such rituals were performed in front of parishioners as part of pagan Christian spring festivals. Nothing had a single meaning. Sex, the body, female anatomy, all of this was perceived as both a source of corruption and a means of salvation. The Catholic interpretation of the female body as the gateway to sin resulted in widespread violence under the guise of healing. Church courts recorded testimonies in which men justified rape by saying that the woman was possessed and that the man's seed is the antidote to the demon. The victims themselves often ended up at the stake for seduction. By the 13th century, lists of sinful practices, prohibited from public discussion, began to appear in the papal chancelleries. One of them was the practice of corpus coitum mortis, sexual rituals with the dead. According to reports from the Papal Inquisition, Members of secret brotherhoods in a number of Italian cities practiced a ritual of copulation with dead girls. It was believed that such an act helped the soul of the deceased enter purgatory. The virginity of the corpse was particularly valued. In one case recorded in Perugia in 1284, a monk healer was executed not for necrophilia, but for desecration without the permission of the order. These practices often took place with the full knowledge or even support of local religious authorities. Many cases of violence, especially against the possessed, were hushed up. But sometimes documents leaked out. The archives of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna contain a complaint from 1297 in which a mother accuses two monks of treating her daughter, during which the girl died of internal ruptures. The investigation established that the procedure included prayer and the insertion of a wooden crucifix into the body, literally. None of the monks were convicted. Towards the 14th century, with the growth of urban literacy, individual hermits and doctors began to record what was happening in detail. One of them, Matteo da Rimini, wrote that a pure virgin, if beaten and then sprinkled with wine, can be freed from demonic passions. He also describes a method whereby snake fat should be inserted into a woman's womb to rid her of desire. The result was extensive burns and gangrene, which, according to the author, was a sign of success. Boys were a separate issue. The Church prohibited homosexual contact, but dozens of letters preserved in Benedictine archives contained descriptions of apprenticeship, during which young men were required to serve their older brother with humility and obedience. A letter from Abbot Hugo of Tournai mentions a nightly ritual of union through rear penetration, presumably anal intercourse, described metaphorically. This was considered an allegory of spiritual unity. But outside the monasteries, things were even more primitive. In peasant villages in northern France, there were recorded cases of therapeutic rape, acts of violence directed at girls with signs of infertility or hysteria. The act itself was performed publicly in front of the elders. Beforehand, the girl was read psalms, beaten with a cane, and dipped in ice water. Everything took place with the consent of the parents and was considered a ritual. Silence about the pain became the norm. None of these acts were called violence. Everything was shrouded in a veil of sanctity, purification, and healing. Sex was not intimate, voluntary, or personal. It was a social ritual, a religious practice, a means of subjugation and violence, an instrument of power. Part 2. Puss, under the cassock. While the tall towers of cathedrals cast shadows on the growing cities, rituals were taking place within their walls that no modern court would have left unpunished. But back then, these were sacred rites. Behind the stone walls of monasteries, experiments continued on the human body, most often on women, often on children, almost always without consent. Flesh was considered filth, but it was through it, as the clergy believed, that redemption could be found, or that which they themselves called divine hunger could be satisfied. In the southern regions of France, especially in the vicinity of Neracourt and Carcassonne, the Cathar heresy spread from the end of the 13th century. They denied matter as evil, but paradoxically it was in their communities that cases were recorded where sexual acts were presented as the separation of spirit and body. Several testimonies have been preserved in papal files. A woman lay down under her brother, and he, without touching her flesh, released his seed on her belly to show that matter is incapable of defiling the spirit. Such practices were called seminalis elevatio, the raising of semen. And yet the darkest pages are not found among the heretics. The main burden of legalistic perversions fell on the official church structure. This was especially true after the beginning of the expansion of the Inquisition, when the Church was granted the right to interrogate and torture not only in matters of faith, but also in matters of moral purity. One of the most frightening practices during this period was the so-called purificatio per veritatem, purification through truth. Under this name was hidden a ritual in which a girl accused of corrupting men, often a widow or orphan, was raped before the eyes of God. In 1879, historian and archivist Mario Belloni published the decoded records of the Inquisition Court of Cremona for 1326, which indicate that the trial of truth was conducted as follows. The accused was chained to a table, and 3 prayers were called in, who raped her in turn. If she screamed, it was considered proof of her guilt. After all, a pure soul should not suffer. If she remained silent, it was considered that she was in league with the devil. In any case, the victim was usually burned at the stake. None of the prayers were held accountable. They acted under oath. Even more terrifying were the events that took place in closed monasteries. One of the most horrific examples is the Abbey of St. Margaret in Salzburg. Documents found during its partial destruction in the 19th century contain the diaries of a nun named Gertrude, who lived around the 1330s. Her writings mention demon expulsion practices, in which young novices were pierced with a sharp cross in the genital area to prevent sin from finding an entrance. This method was called vulvi clausura, sealing of the womb. Many girls died of gangrene. No one was to blame. While the elite and the church lived their lives, the people were not far behind. This was especially true during periods of epidemics. The outbreak of the plague in 1347 gave rise to a new phenomenon: flagellantia sexualis. Pilgrims calling themselves flagellant brothers went through villages and towns, beating themselves and others until they bled. Some groups, as recorded in the chronicles of Metz and Nuremberg, organized purification orgies, where men and women engaged in sexual acts under whips, in the mud, while singing psalms. Such gatherings often escalated into mass rape and sacrifice. One of the most horrific documents of that period is a letter from the abbot of Aosta to Pope Clement VI, dated 1349. In it, he writes, "Our brothers entered virgins while singing Dies Irae, and then burned their bodies, for their flesh was already condemned. Thus, souls were saved through purifying fire and seed." This letter, now in the Vatican archives, has never been discussed, but a copy appears in private collections of Italian historians. Particularly noteworthy is the practice widespread in the second half of the 14th century, known as defloratio sancta, holy defloration. Girls who had reached puberty were often given to the first knight servant of God, a priest or monk, in order to give their purity to the church, not to an animal husband. These rituals were performed as sacraments. Witnesses describe how the priest reads a prayer over the girl, performs the act, and then returns her to her family as a vessel that has been blessed. The girls' bodies were damaged to such an extent that death was not uncommon, especially at a young age. One of the doctors, Jacopo di Fiesole, wrote in 1361, "I examined the bodies of 2 girls after such a ritual. Their vaginas were torn, their insides turned out, and the blood would not stop flowing. Their bodies were offered as a gift to the Lord. This doctor disappeared without a trace a year later. Archives show that his own treatise, De Corpus Virginitatis, was added to the list of banned books at the Council of Basel. Some practices seemed symbolic at first glance but had horrific consequences. For example, the sacred pause ritual used in the monastic vow of chastity. A young monk was allowed to engage in sexual intercourse, but only until the moment of ejaculation, which was considered a sin. How exactly was this controlled? In a simple way, with wooden plugs or iron rings on the penis, which delayed orgasm. Numerous cases of trauma, infection, and even amputations are recorded in monastery journals, under the heading Castigatio Divina, divine punishment. Part 3. The physical torments of salvation. By the 15th century, Europe had already experienced famine, epidemics, crusades, and heresy. But what it knew least about was the body. Everything related to anatomy, desire, arousal, and pain remained the domain of myths, religious symbols, and crude guesswork. Any medical treatise describing female organs from a biological point of view was considered potentially heretical. This meant that people, even scientists, relied on traditions that were based not on experience, but on fear. And this fear led to torture, castration, and divine intervention directly in the genitals. In the city of Modena in 1421, an inquisitor named Francesco Guicciardini approved a new code of purity that described permissible measures to combat the sin of the flesh. Among other things, it mentioned a procedure called exorcismus per ignem, the expulsion of passion through fire. The essence of the procedure was to heat a metal rod, shaped like a male penis, and apply it to the genitals of women suspected of nocturnal lust. The temperature reached third-degree burns. The code stated, "Fire expels the devil, and if the flesh groans, it is not a cry of pain, but the voice of purification." Often, the victims of such rituals did not even understand why they were being punished. It was enough to say that the girl does not eat, does not sleep, looks out the window, and she was taken away. An example from Umbria, 1438. A young woman named Rina, according to her neighbors, often fiddled with her skirt when alone. She was tied up, taken to the monastery of San Benedetto, and subjected to 3 days of treatment, which consisted of fumigation with belladonna smoke, after which a wooden wedge wrapped in prickly grass was inserted into her vagina. 2 days later, she died of sepsis. In the monastery journal, her death was recorded as martyrdom. At that time, the idea of female orgasm as a medical phenomenon was not even discussed. However, there are recorded cases where overly aroused women were suspected of having ties to the devil. One of the most famous cases is that of Lavinia del Campo, Venice, 1454. Her husband filed a complaint with the ecclesiastical court. "My wife screams in her bedroom as if she were being tormented by the devil. Her face is ablaze with the fire of sin." Witnesses confirmed that Lavinia made animal cries during intercourse. This became the basis for her accusation of coitus demonium, sexual intercourse with the devil. Lavinia was tortured for 8 days and then burned at the stake in St. Mark's Square. Her husband was not punished. He was even paid compensation. At the same time, nuns developed a practice that could now be described as a form of sexual self-flagellation. Special objects, unofficially called thronus castitatis, chairs of chastity, were kept in the cells of women's monasteries. These were wooden stools with a hollow in the middle, through which a woman sat directly on sharp spikes. Sometimes they were accompanied by metal elements that pressed against the clitoris or labia minora, causing sharp pain. All this was part of the spiritual struggle against fornication. A letter from Sister Isabella of Toledo, dated 1472, has been preserved, in which she writes, "I sat on the throne for 9 days, and a bloody light covered my shame. The Mother Superior said, 'Now you are free from lust.' Chastity became a cult of pain, but not only for women. In 15th century Paris, a secret brotherhood called the Ordre du Fils Flagellé, Order of the Flagellated Son, spread. Its members, mainly young monks and novices, regularly subjected themselves to collective sessions of self-flagellation, during which their bodies were reduced to open sores. After the session, one of the senior brothers would apply a healing ointment that he had made himself. According to archival records, the ointment contained honey, vinegar, wine, and semen. Hence the origin of the ritual known as unctio seminalis, anointing with semen. This act was considered a symbol of brotherly unity and healing through sacrifice. Over time, such rituals began to be used as a form of initiation. The archives of the Council of Avignon contain a manuscript describing an incident in 1466. A new recruit, upon entering the order, was required to take the bodies of his elder brothers into his mouth as one receives communion. Elsewhere, the document notes, "For semen is part of the male soul, and whoever swallows it, his soul will receive holiness." None of the participants in such rituals were considered homosexual. The concept of sexual orientation did not exist as a social category. There was only guilt and justification for that guilt through religious symbolism, but at the same time, on the other side of the continent, an era was beginning in which violence was combined with pseudoscience. So-called flesh doctors, men who combined religious knowledge with medical and alchemical theories, began to develop their own methods of treating lust. Among them was the horrific practice of sanguinis clitoridectomia, the circumcision of the clitoris, to reduce devilish sensitivity. The archives of the Papal States contain at least 11 documented cases in which girls aged between 9 and 12 had their external genitalia cut off under the guise of treating fiery internal heat. All procedures were performed without anesthesia. Instead, wine was used, blows to the head were administered, or the hands and feet were simply tied. A doctor from Siena, Giovanni de la Corte, writes in his treatise De Vulvae Militia that the organs of sin must be cut off like withered branches of a vineyard. This treatise was kept in a closed library until the end of the 19th century. No copies were published until the 20th century. It is impossible to separate the sexual violence of that time from power. Sex was a form of subjugation, a physical expression of hierarchy, a way of consolidating not just male domination over women, but power over the body as such. And if a man in a cassock said, "This is necessary for salvation," no one had the right to say no. No one even tried. Part 4. The Blessed Depraved. By the 16th century, Europe was already familiar with printing, Vesalius's anatomical drawings, and the first signs of the Reformation. But all this concerned the elite. The vast majority of people, priests, monks, peasants, continued to live within the same myths, in which the body was a vessel for demons, and blood and semen were weapons of either purification or damnation. The difference between medicine and the Inquisition was blurred. Church doctors used torture as therapy. Sexual practices were used as rituals. Desecration was a way of getting closer to God, One of the most disturbing trends of the era was the widespread practice of defloratio salvifica, salvific defloration, in Catholic shelters and orphanages. Founded to educate fallen girls and foundlings, these institutions quickly turned into closed zones of sexual violence. A document from the Salamanca archives, dated 1537, states, "Every new girl found on the street must be examined by a clergyman, and, if necessary, subjected to purification of the flesh through intimacy." Necessity was understood to mean any form of physical manifestation: blood, gaze, trembling hands. Virginity was considered a sacred resource. In some monasteries, its sale became a source of income. In Turin, according to a 1543 synod report, abbesses received donations from the nobility for the right to spend the first night with a novice nun. This was formalized as a sacrament of blessing. The diary of Constable Filiberto de Sassari contains the following entry. "I took the maiden Augusta in Maria's cell, gave her salt and oil, and made her my holy wife of honor. She did not cry out. She blessed me." A week later, Augustine died of internal injuries. Her death was declared a transition to eternal joy. Such rituals were not accidental. They were repeated from monastery to monastery. From 1500 to 1600, dozens of identical cases were recorded throughout the territory, from Burgundy to Sicily. Girls were often brought to monasteries at the age of 7 or 8. By the time of their consecration, they were no older than 10. The Inquisition documents did not directly condemn the practice, as it was presented as part of spiritual discipline. At the same time, outside the monastery walls, the people developed their own, equally barbaric, sexual rituals. The most famous of these was cura stupri per sanguinem, treatment of rape through blood. The essence of the ritual was that a girl who had been raped in a village was not taken to court or to church. She was subjected to another act of violence, this time ritual, in the presence of elders in order to wash away the shame with shame. In some villages in Franconia and Piedmont, women themselves accompanied the victims to the field, where the purification ritual took place. Those who resisted were beaten unconscious. Only then did the purification begin. Historian Tilman Kreitz, in his 1982 study, calls this phenomenon double rape by tradition. After that, the girl was considered purified and could get married. Without the ritual, never. Victims who did not undergo treatment became forever cursed, often fleeing to the woods or ending their lives by suicide. At the same time, attention to male intemperance intensified. Concerned about the growth of unclean thoughts among young novices, the church authorities began to actively practice penis vigilum, vigilance over the penis. Young men were examined daily for erections. If one was detected, punishment followed. The most well-known form was a punitive bandage made of wire, fastened around the base of the penis, which caused pain when it grew. In the monastery of San Luigi in Tuscany, drawings were found of a device that pierced the skin when an erection occurred. The punishment for nocturnal defilement, wet dreams, was particularly cruel. Monks were forced to sleep on a stone with their hands tied to the wall. Those who still experienced an erection were subjected to the so-called flagrum testicularis, flogging of the scrotum. Sometimes this was done in front of other brothers. The monastery rules stated, "A member who lusts at night shall be punished by the light of day, so that he may know the fear of the Lord." One of the most terrifying rituals of that century was recorded in Krakow in 1583. A girl named Katarzyna was declared possessed. The priest announced that the devil had entered her womb. The treatment included exorcising the demon through physical reunion. The priest entered her 3 times on the altar, each time reading passages from the Psalter. On the 4th attempt, Katarzyna died from internal organ rupture. The girl's mother filed a complaint with the diocese, but she was convicted of slander. She was burned alongside her daughter in the same square. The Church, meanwhile, continued to cultivate a cult of the suffering body. Mystics wrote treatises asserting that a woman's wetness is a sign of her guilt, and that all passion must be burned out, for it is not from God. Blood, semen, vaginal secretions, all of this was perceived as proof of sin pouring out from within. In church rhetoric, the female body was turned into a rotten vessel, and the male body into a weapon of God. The paradox was that behind the facade of morality, systematic rape, incest, and murder were widespread. At the same time, it was in the 16th century that the first evidence of rituals involving corpses appeared in large monasteries. In Siena, according to the testimony of a former novice, monks dug up the bodies of recently deceased nuns and had sex with them until dawn, explaining that the body had not yet lost its grace. One of the accused said, "She was silent, so she didn't resist." Death, silence, blood, semen, fire. Everything merged into a single language of salvation. Part 5. The last person to touch the body. By the 17th century, the bonfires had not yet been extinguished. The Inquisition was still breathing down their necks, and the shadows of monasteries stretched like fangs against the backdrop of the advancing Enlightenment. The world began to build anatomical theaters, print works on hygiene, and invent the microscope. But behind the doors of thousands of parish houses, in cells and peasant huts, bodies continued to be broken under the guise of piety. Sex in Europe during this century became the subject of hidden paranoia. Increasingly, both secular and spiritual authorities attempted to control not only sexual acts, but also the very thought of them. Fear of lust became a tool of discipline. They even coined the term coitus mentalis, mental intercourse. It was applied to anyone who, in the opinion of priests, looked too long, prayed too fervently, or walked alone too often. Women remained the main targets. In 1609, the convent of St. Gertrude in Trier developed a method of restoring virginity through faith. Girls who were considered corrupt were injected with solutions of salt, vinegar, and ash to cause internal bleeding, after which they were declared pure again. In some cases, even lye was used. A monastery document records a case in which a girl named Elsa died in terrible agony after such a procedure. The abbess wrote in the journal, "She expelled the old filth from her body. Now her soul shines." Meanwhile, new forms of ritual male subjugation emerged. Appeared. In the Capuchin order, the rite of ejaculatio dolorosa, or painful ejaculation, became widespread. Young monks were forced to masturbate under the supervision of their senior brothers, while their palms were wrapped in barbed wire or burnt canvas. The act was not supposed to end in ejaculation. If semen leaked out, it was collected and added to the lamps in memory of lost grace. The process itself was considered a test of will. Refusal was punishable by flogging or nighttime isolation in an ice-cold cell without clothes. But, as before, the most horrific episodes occurred at the intersection of fear and power. The so-called order novices played a special role here. These girls, often from poor families, were sold by their parents to monasteries or private homes of clergy. In Rome, Milan, and Prague, there were entire secret networks supplying large church figures with obedient bodies. Officially, it was for domestic help. In reality, it was for satisfaction. In the notes of a bishop from Avignon, we read, "My little Agatha knows how to bring water, a candle, and comfort in the dark. I taught her to pray while lying down." Violence was disguised as ritual. One of the most perverted forms was communio carnalis, carnal communion. Inside some closed monasteries, male priests were allowed to visit nuns for sanctification through union. Before the act, a psalm was read, followed by the introduction of semen as a holy essence. Some treatises of the time claimed that in this way the nuns were united with the Spirit of the Lord through the flesh of his servant. In 9 out of 10 cases, these were underage girls who had no choice. Women who became pregnant from such rituals were subjected to the most brutal torture. They were accused of coitus cum demonio. Allegedly, only a witch who had entered into a union with Satan could conceive a child. If the baby survived, it was usually killed on the pretext that the devil's seed must not take root. A document from 1617 has been preserved in the archives of Cagliari, Sardinia. The birth of a black child in a monastery. The mother was a raped novice. The child was drowned in the monastery well. The mother was locked in a cellar for 16 years. She died in chains. Meanwhile, superstition only grew stronger. In Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary, beliefs spread about night demons who came to priests and tempted the flesh. The Church took these myths seriously. Monks who succumbed to temptation in their sleep were subjected to corporal punishment. One of the records of the monastery of St. Wenceslas reads, "Brother Joseph said that he saw a woman in a dream and ejaculated. We placed a crown of thorns on his head and beat him in the refectory. May he remember, the way to paradise is through pain." Among ordinary people, too, there were rituals that made the blood run cold. In the village of Grunwald, in 1625, a night of healing was recorded. A ritual in which women considered possessed by desire were forcibly tied to trees and raped by groups of men, supposedly to calm their demons. This ritual was approved by the local pastor, who wrote, "The devil was cast out by the semen of the brotherhood. In the morning the women cried and prayed. This means they are purified. None of the men were convicted. On the contrary, they were given communion. The church authorities not only knew about these practices, but also systematized them." In 1633, the Council of Trent discussed the question of the limits of healing lustful passions. One of the bishops proposed formally establishing the rites of introduction of holy seed as a method of monastic discipline. The document was not put to a vote, but its existence is confirmed in the Vatican archives. And yet, by the end of the century, the wind began to change. Cases such as those described above began to cause not only whispers, but cries. A wave of renunciations began. People who had survived sexual abuse in monasteries began to write anonymous letters and pass on stories through doctors, pharmacists, and healers. Some monks, repentant, left notes in their cells before they died. Among them was Brother Augustine of Leipzig, who wrote, "I defiled a virgin 3 times in the name of God. I felt him remain silent." These stories did not make it into textbooks. They are not quoted in popular chronicles, but they lie in archives, in the shadows of paintings and icons, in parchment soaked with pain. They are not a myth. They are a reminder that faith, perverted into power, is capable not of elevating, but of trampling. That salvation without consent is torture. That holiness, taken in a fist, is rape. That history does not moralize. It simply says, it happened.